This video is going to be covering the material that is in Module 9 of Biology. I'm going to try to cover most of that module in this video, so it may get a little bit longer than some, but we're also going to be abbreviating some of the discussion and just kind of hit what are the most important points. So this chapter is on evolution, and how our discussion will focus a lot on how we as Christians should look at evidence that is presented in favor of evolution and critically assess that information and see what conclusions we can come to. One of the important things to recognize in our discussion of evolution versus creationism is that both evolutionists and creationists who believe that God created the world, both groups are studying the same information. They're studying the same scientific information, but come to quite different conclusions. And so keep in mind that the point at which you begin influences how you will interpret the data. So if a person comes looking at the data believing that there is no God, then they are going to come to a different conclusion looking at that data than someone who believes that there is a God and that God was actively involved in creating the world. So we'll see throughout our discussion that the data that is studied is the same for both groups, but depending on your starting point, you can come to very different conclusions. So I'm sure you have all heard of Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin lived, he was born in the early 1800s, and in the year 1831, he took part in an expedition to the Galapagos Islands, and this was aboard the HMS Beagle. So these islands are, they're a chain of islands that are just about 600 miles west of Ecuador in South America. And they're a chain of islands. And while on this ship, he was invited to go along as a naturalist. While on this ship, he studied finches, and we'll look at some of the things that he observed in a few minutes. But based on that study that Darwin did, and then also based on some other observations that he made, he published the book that he is most famous for in 1859. That is, the short title is called The Origin of the Species. It has a longer title, but it's basically usually referred to as just The Origin of the Species. So let's look at some of Darwin's theories, actually start by just looking at some of the studies that he made while he was on the Galapagos Islands. Okay, so let's look at this. So one of the first things that he studied were finches, and he especially focused on the beaks of these finches. And what he noticed in looking at these finches was that their beaks could be very different. So he noticed that some finches had kind of smaller, thinner beaks, and those types of finches usually ate insects. Okay, so insects with a thinner, more slender beak. But then he noticed that there were some other finches that would, if they wanted to eat an egg, to break into an egg, they would actually kick that egg into a rock, and then they would use the beak to kind of grasp onto it while they broke it. So different kind of beak and a different way that beak worked. And then finally, he noticed that there were finches that had very large beaks, and those finches used their beaks to crack very hard seeds. Well, some people might assume that these finches were created or designed by God with different beaks, because they had different beaks were needed for the food that was eaten by each one. But what Darwin concluded was that each of these finches came from a common ancestor, and that over time, as their feeding needs differed, then that common ancestor evolved into different species. So if food were scarce, then those with a certain beak type would be better able to compete with other finches for food, and they would survive. And then when they reproduce, they would pass on that beak type to their offspring. And then that's going to happen over generations of these birds, so that over a period of time we get animals surviving, because they adapt to the point of being able to survive under situations where food might be scarce, or there might be certain environmental conditions. So what Darwin called this idea was natural selection. Sometimes it's also referred to as survival of the fittest. So he said that all species of finches could have come from a single type of finch, and that over time, those finches that were better suited to survival under certain conditions would survive and pass those characteristics on to their offspring. And Darwin went further, however, with this idea, and he stated that a simple life form on Earth would be able to reproduce, and variations would occur based on natural selection, and eventually there would be a new species. So he thought that all life forms on Earth could be explained by natural selection or by survival of the fittest. And this brings us then to making sure that we understand the difference between macro evolution and micro evolution. Okay, macro evolution. So Darwin experimented with pigeons, and he talked to breeders of different species of pigeons, and he thought that over generations, pigeons and horses and dogs resulted that were so different from the original organism that they could be considered a new species of pigeon, horse, or dog. And then he also studied, so he talked to breeders, and then he also looked at the comparisons between wild animals and domesticated animals. And he said that with natural selection, one species can change over time to become a new species. And he really refuted, rightly so, he refuted the idea of what is referred to as immutability of species. And what immutability of species means is that this is the idea that every species was created by God and never changes. So every species was created by God in the Garden of Eden and never changes. So by studying pigeons, horses, dogs, by talking to breeders of these different animals, Darwin was able to disprove this idea of the immutability of species. So this theory would say that all species of dogs that exist today existed in the Garden of Eden. Well, Darwin showed that all dogs come from a common ancestors, but through variations in reproduction and through natural selection or breeding, many different breeds of dogs have resulted. Okay, so he was able to dispute and disprove the idea of immutability of species. But where Darwin ran into trouble with his hypothesis was that he wanted to say that the same processes that we see that allow different breeds of dogs to come about, or that allow a finch to have a finch's beak to change over time. He wanted to take this even further and say that these same processes with enough time could you could get a completely different animal. So, for example, he wanted to say that the changes that you see taking place in a finch's beak, if you gave those enough time, that finch could eventually become an eagle. So, getting back then to the idea of the distinction between macroevolution and microevolution. So microevolution and there is a lot of evidence for microevolution. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But what microevolution says is that natural selection or survival of the fittest over time can take an organism and change it into a specialized species of that organism. So there is a lot of evidence for microevolution. If we just look at human beings, we can, if we trace human beings over time, human beings are getting taller, they're getting bigger, and a lot of that we think is attributed to the fact that we have better nutrition. Now people are eating better. So humans are getting taller. And my kids and I sometimes joke about how tall, because if we look at the change in height across generations, I mean, of course it's not true in every single individual, but if we look at the change in time, in height across generations, it's clear that humans are getting taller. And my kids and I sometimes joke and wonder how tall human beings, given enough time, how tall human beings will eventually evolve to be. But so there is plenty of examples and evidence of microevolution. We see microevolution in dog breeds, and I mean even just in the last 25 years, there have been new dog breeds created, as it were, by mating of different dog breeds. So there is lots of evidence for natural selection taking place. But natural selection is just that within an organism, changes are taking place that allow that organism to become more specialized. Microevolution, on the other hand, is the idea that, macroevolution. Macroevolution is the idea that over time, an organism can transform into a completely different type of organism. So this would be the idea that over time, a bacteria cell, which we consider, even though we know it's not that simple, which considered the simplest life form, that given enough time, a bacteria could be transformed into a much more complex organism, even to the point of being transformed into a human. Okay, so one of my big problems with the idea of evolution is that evolutionists have never been able to explain where life comes from. If we think about the Big Bang theory, which is purported to be the way that the Earth began, that theory is not able to answer how did something get created from nothing. Nothing has ever been created from nothing, and there's never been anything created from nothing except that God was able to do it. So if you taking God out of the picture, evolutionists are not able to explain how something came to be out of nothing. And then the other thing that is a difficulty for me is, where did life come from? If Earth started as just a bunch of inorganic elements, then how did life emerge from those inorganic compounds? So the idea that, well, first of all, the idea that a simple organism could be transformed into a complex organism, that's macroevolution. But even before that, we have to deal with the question about, where did life even come from? Yeah, if you take God out of the picture. Remember that Darwin was doing this stuff in the mid to late 1800s, and that was long before we knew anything about DNA and the genetic code. So we now know, we just studied genetics, and so that that characteristics are determined by your genetic code and what alleles you have on that genetic code. So there's a limit to how much a species can change based on its genetic code. Now, there is evidence that when an organism undergoes microevolutionary changes, that there are minor modifications in the genetic code, but those are not to the magnitude where you could say that one organism evolved into another type of organism. So the genetic code really limits the amount of change that an organism can undergo. So macroevolution assumes that there is an unlimited ability to change. And if there is an unlimited ability to change, that would have to happen. That would have to mean that there is a very big change in the genetic code. I'd like for us to look at On Your Own 9.4 in your book, so we can get some practice looking at the differences. So this is On Your Own 9.4, and I'll read that. It says that house sparrows are small, seed-eating birds that are native to parts of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. In the fall of 1851 and the spring of 1852, 100 of these birds were brought to Brooklyn, New York. Since then, they have spread throughout the United States. Even though the original 100 birds were all very similar, their descendants are not. In fact, if you study the size of house sparrows in the United States, you will find that they are bigger in the northern parts of the United States and smaller in the southern parts. Is this an example of microevolution or macroevolution? Okay, so the answer to that is an example of microevolution. Okay, the house sparrows have not changed into a different organism. Their body size has changed, but they have not become a different organism. And then the second question asks, well, can you think of a way that we might be able to explain those differences? And I mean, if differences are between the north and the south, it's probably due to climate. So a larger bird would be better able to survive a colder climate. So as generations passed, the larger birds that were more suited to a larger climate would survive, and then as they would mate, they would produce larger birds, and over time the sparrows in the northern part of the United States became larger than the sparrows in the southern part of the United States. So that is an example of microevolution. Okay, and then if we look at on your own 9.5, some biologists believe that the whale once had a cow-like ancestor that lived on land. This ancestor was very heavy, so it started spending a great deal of time in the water. The water helped buoy it up, making it easier for the animal to walk. As time went on, the animal began adapting to the water, slowly changing its legs into fins and its skin into a substance more ideal for swimming in the water. Eventually, the cow-like creature gave rise to the whale. Is this an example of macroevolution or microevolution? Okay, so there we have a cow-like creature getting transformed into a whale, and that would definitely be an example of macroevolution. And in order for that kind of transformation to happen, there would have to be a change in the genetic code. And in order for macroevolution to be true, that is what would have to happen, is you have to have a change in the genetic code. Okay, so that's in a nutshell, the basic distinction between macroevolution and microevolution. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to look at some of the data, some of the scientific information that we have that is used to, as I said, used to support both evolutionary theory, but also used by people who believe in creation to say this doesn't support evolutionary theory. So the first thing we're going to look at is something called the geological column. Okay. If we look at geology, you might remember that we classify rock as igneous rock, metamorphic rock, and sedimentary rock. And if we look at the geological column, sedimentary rock, which comes from laying down sediment, layers of sediment. So geologists look at sedimentary rock, and it's laid down in these layers, and those distinct layers are called strata. These are distinct layers of sediment. And what and so we have these layers of sediment, and if we look within the different layers of sediment, there are fossils. And as you know, a fossil is just preserved remains of dead organisms. So geologists have given these layers different names, and they start at the bottom, and then we look at the fossils that are found in the different layers of this geological column. So let me show you a picture then of the geological column. Okay, so this is the geological column. Let's see, get that all up there a little bit larger. Okay, so the thing I want you to see from this is that so these are the layers that are close. The quaternary rock is closer to the surface. The Precambrian rock down here is that which is, as you go deeper into the layers of sedimentary rock. So each of these rows represents a layer of sedimentary rock. So these are closer to the surface up here, and down here these are farther underneath the surface, and this whole thing is called the geological column. Okay, so and then they look at fossils that are found in those different layers. Okay, so if we look at that, one of the things that you might conclude is that as you go deeper, you have more simple life forms. Okay, so deeper, more simple life forms. And as you get closer to the surface, then the life forms are more complex. So, so the evolutionary theorists then take this information to say that the simpler life forms occurred earlier, and then that over time, those simple life forms evolved into more complex life forms like human beings that we see today. Okay, so the couple things that you have to bear in mind when we think about the geological column. Okay, the first thing is that the geological column really is not a good representation of the fossil record, because when we think about the fossils that are found, the fossils that we have found and that are available to us to study, 95% of all fossils that are found are of simple life forms. So basically, when we look at these changes as these layers become more and more complex life forms, these higher layers really only represent about 5% of all fossils that are found. And most of the fossils that we find are, so 95% of the fossils are in these simpler life forms. So this geological column really is not a good representation of the fossils that are found. If we look at the geological column, it's probably a pretty good representation of how rock, it's probably a pretty good representation of the rock layers on Earth, but the question becomes, how long did this take? Because there is evidence that shows that that some organisms can change over long periods of time, but or that these different layers could have developed over long periods of time. But we also have evidence that they can happen, that different layers of sediment can be laid down in a very short period of time. So in the mid 1980s, there was a volcano that erupted in Washington State called Mount St. Helens, and by studying that and there's other examples of this, they were able to find that with that natural catastrophe, that there were layers of sediment laid down in a very short period of time. So we really don't know how long it took for this geological column to be laid down, because it could have happened with one big catastrophic event like the flood. So this geological column could be used as evidence for or against macroevolution. We really don't know. I'll mention as kind of a side that most evolutionists think it's ridiculous to believe that there was once a worldwide flood, and yet I just saw an article in the news stating that because of climate change, that there are scientists who believe that if climate change continues to happen the way they say it's happening now, that there will be a worldwide flood. So they deny the fact that there could have been a worldwide flood, thousands of years ago, and yet at the same time they're saying that there will be a worldwide flood due to global warming or due to climate change. The other thing that I want you to realize about this geological column is these layers are not clear cut. I mean, you can't, if we look at the different layers, well, first of all, nowhere in the world do you find all these layers. So this geological column is put together because at one point in the Earth we find this layer, at another point we find this layer, somewhere else we find this layer, and then then scientists have constructed this geological column. But there is no place on Earth where all of these layers of rock exist in a single location. But Darwin and evolutionary theorists today believe that, at one time we just had these simple organisms like bacteria, and then that over time um, those evolved to more complex forms, and as those organisms died, they got laid down in different layers of rock. Okay, so that is the geological column. Let me put a few terms up here just so I'm sure you have heard of this word, paleontology. So paleontology is the study of the fossil record. And in order to support the idea of macroevolution, then what needs to be shown are intermediate links, or fossils that would show that there is a link, that there's an intermediate form between two different species. So, and Darwin himself admitted that his hypothesis really hinged on finding these intermediate links. And he actually said himself that the fact that there had been no intermediate links discovered, that was a grave problem. But he was convinced that with enough time, given enough time, that these intermediate links would be found. So we're now 175 years approximately from the time of Darwin, and these intermediate links still have not been found. So that's a major problem for Darwin's theory of macroevolution. There are different ideas presented as to why those intermediate links have not been discovered. And one of those is called punctuated equilibrium. And what punctuated equilibrium says is that intermediate forms did exist, but they did not exist for very long. And because they did not exist for very long, they did not get fossilized. Okay, now I see some problems with that. First of all is, so these intermediate links, they would have had to exist long enough to reproduce. And if they were reproducing, then why weren't they there long enough to be fossilized? So I think this idea of punctuated equilibrium is a pretty weak explanation for why we have not found any intermediate links. So they're just saying there's no chance of them fossilizing, and therefore no chance of us finding fossils because these transitional forms did not live very long. There have been found some fossils that have been said to be transitional forms. And I think your book gives the name of one. Well, your book has a long discussion about some fossils that were found to look like a bird, and all the characteristics are very similar to a bird, except that this organism had teeth and probably had some small claws on its wings, and so they have used that to say that that was a transitional form between a reptile and a bird. And yet, if we look at all the other characteristics of that bird, in terms of what the feathers are like, based on their bone structure, based on the lung structure, everything else is like a bird. And so they really concentrate on this idea that it had teeth and it had these small claws, to say that it was an intermediate form of a bird changing into a reptile. Another example is a skeleton that is supposed to be a transitional form between apes and humans. And there is a scientific name for this, but we usually just refer to this skeleton as Lucy. It was found in the 1970s, 1974 in Ethiopia. And a couple things to think about so there's a drawing of this skeleton, and one of the first things you'll notice, this is on figure 9.4 in your book. So if you want to turn there and look at that, that's on page 278. Okay, so they have a drawing there of this skeleton that was found, and when you look at that, you might think, oh, that's not a very complete skeleton, and it's not, except that this was a very big find, because most of the skeletons that are found are much less than this, and sometimes they'll just find a single bone and then try to reconstruct a full skeleton from that single bone. So this finding of Lucy was a big find, and there's a lot that we can learn from it. So they've tended to focus on in this skeleton, they tended to focus on the hip joint and ankle joints, because apes and humans walk differently. So most apes are more comfortable walking on all fours, while humans walk on two. So it's because they said it's possible that that Lucy walked upright, then she was considered to be an intermediate link between man and ape. However, one area that they've looked at more recently are the knuckles. And based on examination of the knuckles, they actually demonstrated that the knuckles of Lucy are very similar to chimpanzees that we know today. So if we look at the wrist and the knuckles of this skeleton, it appears more that Lucy would have walked on her knuckles like an ape walks on its knuckles, not upright like humans do. So again, this is where creationists and evolutionists are looking at the same information and coming to different conclusions based on whether you include God as part of the picture or whether you don't. So if you want to believe in macroevolution, then you're going to look for possibilities that this skeleton could have stood upright. If you don't want to believe in evolution, then you're going to look at the skeleton and you're going to try to find details of that would support the idea that the animal, the skeleton did not look upright. I'll mention another one. Another area that they studied in this was the inner ear, and you know our balance centers are contained within our inner ear, and based on the structure of the inner ear, the conclusion was that that the inner ear was more similar to that of apes than it is to humans. So, you know, an animal that walks on all fours, its inner ear and the balance mechanism is going to be different than an animal that is going to be walking upright. So, so this Lucy skeleton can be used to it's used by evolutionists to support evolution, but it's also can be used by creation scientists to support creationism. Okay. Okay, well, the next thing we're going to talk about is something called the Cambrian explosion. Cambrian explosion. And the Cambrian explosion in the early 1900s, there were a lot of fossils discovered in the Cambrian layer. So I'll go back, I'll take us back to look at that figure of the geological column in just a moment. And among those fossils were very complex life forms. And in fact, they found fossils from nearly every phyla. So from very simple life forms, but also very complex life forms. So fossils were found that were too complex to have evolved if you assume macroevolution, fossils were found in the Cambrian layer that would have been too complex to have evolved in that period of time. So let's go back and look at that. So here's the Cambrian layer right here. Okay, so it's a lower layer where you see just aquatic life forms. If you've ever gone fossil hunting, I don't know Indiana well enough to know where there are places where you can find a lot of fossils, but there was a place in Minnesota that we used to go to, and much of what you find are these, aquatic life forms. And so in this Cambrian explosion, at a very low, one of the very deeper layers of sediment, there were found very complex life forms. And you would think that would be a big finding and something that would be, widely published, but it actually was just published in a very obscure journal, and they were placed somewhere, and they weren't really given any attention again until about the 1970s. And then they were brought out again, and basically the Cambrian explosion, if you take the Cambrian explosion, the fossils would say that it only took about 70 million years to go from the simplest life form to the most complex life form, and based on what we know about macroevolution and how long it takes to take place, it couldn't have happened in 70 million years. Evolutionists say that it took billions of years for this to happen. So this term is used to explain that there must have been an explosion of life during this period. And so basically a large amount of macroevolution would have had to have occurred during the Cambrian period. And there's no evidence for that, because one of the things they didn't find in the Cambrian layer, this Cambrian explosion, was they didn't find any transitional forms. Again, macroevolutionists believe that these intermediate forms do exist. They believe that there are these intermediate links, but we just haven't found they just weren't fossilized, or we haven't found them. Okay, a couple more areas that we'll look at that one area is called structural homology. That's a mouthful. And all this means is that you just study similar structures in different species. So you would look at like arm bones from different species. So you'd look at the upper arm bone, you'd look at the fingers, and what an evolutionist would say is that if the upper arm bone of a bird is similar to the upper arm bone of a human, then they must have evolved from the same species. Given enough time, they must have evolved from the same species. But what we now know about DNA is that if they evolved from a similar ancestors, then their DNA should be similar. And that is not the case. So similar structures can have very different gene structures. So that's that. There's not just because the just because certain features look very similar in different organisms, that doesn't mean that they evolved from the same species, because their DNA would still be very different. So this is an example where evolutionists and creationists look at information and come to very different conclusions. So a creationist might look at the fact that a bird humerus, the upper arm bone, is very similar to a human humerus, and a creationist would say, well, God, the design of the humerus is a wonderful design, and so it works across different species, and therefore, these species were created to have similar upper arm bones because of the way that they work. Whereas an evolutionist takes that information and says, oh, they must have all evolved from the same species. So that is structural homology. The last area that we are going, no, actually we're going to do a couple, two more things. One is molecular biology. So remember that most of what DNA tells is it tells our bodies what proteins to make, and those proteins are made up of amino acids. So one of the things that that we could look at is we could look at the different proteins in different organisms, and if we look at different proteins, so one protein that is often looked at is something called cytochrome C. So this is a protein, and just about every living organism has cytochrome C, and it should be an E on the end here. It performs the same job in different species. So you would think that the amino acids that are linked together to make cytochrome C would be exactly the same in every species because it performs the exact same job. And that yet, if we look at the data, cytochrome C, the amino acid sequences are different from species to species. So let me put up some numbers here so you can see, and some of these are in your book, so you could look at page let's see, you could look at page 287 in your book. And what we see there, I'm just going to pull out a few. So if we look at a yeast, so a yeast is, it's a very simple organism. And what this chart is doing is it's looking at how is the amino acid sequence of a bacteria compared to yeast. Well, 69% of the amino acid sequences between a bacteria and a yeast are the same. But then we can look at something that's much more complex, like a pigeon. And we see that the amino acid sequence between a bacteria and a pigeon is about 64%. And if we look at something even more complex, like a horse, we see that the amino acid sequencing between a bacteria and a horse is also only 64%. So remember that macroevolutionists say that all life forms develop from a bacteria. Well, a bacteria and a yeast are pretty similar to each other. I mean, a yeast is like the next least common or least complex life organism, and yet it only shares about the same amount of amino acid sequencing as a much more complex organism, the horse. So when we look at amino acid sequencing, there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that um, that um, to support the idea of macroevolution, because you would think if cytochrome C performs the same job in different organisms, then you would think that its amino acid sequencing should be very similar from organism to organism. And besides cytochrome C, you can look at other. There are other. Hemoglobin is one that you can look at. Then you can look at the amino acid sequencing, and it is also different. And there are some more tables in your book that you can look at and see that if you compare the percent difference between a bacteria and between a human, there's not a lot of concrete evidence to suggest that macroevolution took place. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about is something called punctuated equilibrium. Okay, so punctuated equilibrium says that the process of evolution takes place in quick punctuations followed by periods of time when not much happens. Okay, so you have these periods of time when you get a lot of changes taking place, but then that is followed by times when no evolution occurs. And they say that, or according to this theory, organisms might be exposed to like high levels of toxic chemicals or radiation, and that would lead to a lot of mutations or changes in the genetic code, so that when that happens, most of the organisms would die, but some would get good mutations and they would survive, and they would incorporate those good mutations would be incorporated into their genetic code. And then when they produce offspring, those offspring would have those good mutations. So most would die, but some would live. And they believe that during these periods of punctuated equilibrium, that information is actually added to the genetic code. And that over several generations, because you're actually adding information to the genetic code, that a new species would emerge. And that species would exist for millions of years without changing. And then you would have a period of time when you'd have another round of high mutations. And then, that period of high mutations, again, more some good mutations would happen, and those would get added to the genetic code, and they would reproduce, and over a long enough period of time, you would get a new species. So with punctuated equilibrium, what the macroevolutionists would say is that whatever intermediate links might have existed would have existed for a very short period of time. And so they didn't have time to get fossilized. So short time, or existed for a short time, and therefore not fossilized. So their explanation for not finding intermediate links would be that they just didn't exist for long enough to be fossilized. They weren't there long enough to actually be part of the fossil record. So they would say, yeah, these links, these intermediate links existed, but they didn't exist for very long, so their chance of being fossilized is very small. Your book shows some pictures. So if we were to look at, let me draw 3 graphs. These are in your book on page 292. Darwin's theory of evolution is that, so this would be Darwin. So this would be, if we put time on this axis and change on this axis, Darwin would say that there, over time, there's kind of been steady, constant change that happens. And actually, then the only other one I'll show will be then what punctuated equilibrium would look like. Then would be this, where you have change. Let's draw that again. So here's time, and here's change. And what punctuated equilibrium would say is that there would be a period of time when change would be happening, but then there would be time when nothing is happening. Change is happening, then nothing is happening. Change is happening, nothing is happening. Change, nothing. So this would be punctuated equilibrium. And for those who hold to this theory, they would conclude that the organisms that were alive, the transitional forms that were formed during these periods of punctuated change didn't exist long enough for them. The chance of them being fossilized would be very small. But basically you can see that the end result for both Darwinism and for punctuated equilibrium is that you're getting a change over time. It's just a matter of whether it's a steady change or whether it's happening over punctuated periods. So that's we've really only touched the surface for evolution. There are books upon books upon books. There are whole courses you can take. There is an idea that is, I think, gaining more popularity even among evolutionary scientists, and we'll talk at least for the Cornerstone students We'll talk next week a little bit more about an idea of that is gaining traction called intelligent design. So again, we've just touched the surface of a very broad topic, and in a course of this nature, we just don't have time to hit on everything.